Hello, welcome to the Psalming Effect for this week. It's June 21st, Monday in southeast Saskatchewan, and I'm John Smith. I minister with the church here in the city of Weyburn. And today I'm going to be sharing from Psalm 36. I have shared with this psalm before. In fact, I think the first Sunday of this year I shared from this psalm, but some different thoughts that I have today. Actually, my thought for today is really, in a sentence, is this: I am called to be an environmentalist. Now, I don't want that to scare you off if you don't like all the discussion about climate change and the warming planet and the depleting ozone and the melting ice caps and you think all of that discussion is irrelevant and maybe misguided and too much policy controlling environmental things is bothering the economy that you depend on. I don't want you to think that when I say I am called to be an environmentalist, that I'm somehow going to be on one side or the other of any of those issues. Maybe I should just quickly read the verses I'm referring to, and you'll see that that's not anywhere in the focus that I have. It's Psalm 36, and I'm reading verses 5 through 9. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your judgments are like the great deep. You save humans and animals alike, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. All people may take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light, we see light. So what do I mean by I am called to be an environmentalist? Well, here in Psalm 36, especially these verses, David is emphasizing that we live in a spiritual environment here on this earth. We live in the spiritual environment of God's steadfast love, His faithfulness, His righteousness, and His judgments. That all forms an environment in which we live. God created us to participate in a biosphere that is both physical and spiritual. Okay, there are all these things that are spiritual: God's love, His faithfulness, His righteousness, His judgments. There's all the things that God does and is, and we live in that environment at the same time as we live in a physical universe, in cosmos, that God has created that has astronomy and biology and meteorology, climatology, and all of that going on in our physical bodies and our health and all of those realities. We live in a biosphere. Why do I use that word? When I was, I don't remember exactly what year in school it was, but we built biospheres. We built it in a globe. It was like a fish bowl that had a flat bottom and could sit on in a window because it needed sunlight, and it had a lid on it that sealed it, but that we opened the lid and then we put stuff in there. I don't remember what all we put in there. I think we put some. Anyways, we put different things in there, including soil and a few plants, and I think we even put some bugs in there, maybe grubs or snails or something, and maybe a little bit of moisture. And then we sealed the top, and so that globe, and we set it in a window, and that globe was our little biosphere. It was like our universe to see how life would function. And every now and then we had to take the lid off maybe and let some air in, or maybe we had to add stuff to keep it going. But I remember how delicate or how fragile that biosphere was. It didn't take long if you had too much moisture, or if you didn't have enough moisture, or you didn't seal it enough, and so too much air got in, then the biosphere would change and the life that was in there would perish. And it was difficult. Well, I'm reminded by many of the Psalms how really mind-blowing it is that God has placed us in a biosphere that functions so well, both physically and spiritually. It's and a lot of the Psalms focus on these things. Some of the Psalms celebrate our physical and material environment, like Psalms 8, for instance. Or some of the Psalms focus on the spiritual environment, which this Psalm 36 that we're looking at today does. And some of the Psalms touch on both. Like I think of Psalm 19, which talks about God's handiwork in creation, and then also talks about his word and some other spiritual things that are a part of our environment, the biosphere that we live in. And it's not that we live in one or the other at different times and move back and forth. We are in a biosphere that our Creator established, which is both at the same time a physical and a spiritual reality. That's our life that we live. We cannot disregard one and solely focus on the other without experiencing some harm. It's like spending time in the home of a married couple. I'm going to use this as an example that'll maybe help make that clear. It would be disrespectful and deficient and maybe even destructive if someone came to my house and stayed and didn't give any attention to my wife, Jane. Only gave attention to me. Behaved with manners and with conversation and with everything according to me and what they knew of me, and only paid attention to me. Totally disregarded Jane, who is the other person in this marriage that has built this home. And of course, the same thing would be true if a person came to be a guest or even a resident in my house and disregarded me and just gave all their attention and built all their behavior and conversation and everything they did in the house around Jane, and totally ignored me. That would be unhealthy. That would not be right. This home, it's my home, and it's Jane's home, and we are distinct individuals, but it's our home together. You can't live in our home and it not be the home of John and Jane. Okay, that's the nature of a marriage. That's the biosphere in which you enter if you come to our house. Well, that's the same thing that's true about our life from birth to the grave. We come into this world that is physical and is spiritual. It's an environment of physics and geology and all of those things, atoms and, all that stuff. But it's also an environment of God's righteousness, God's faithfulness, his steadfast love, and all of those spiritual things. And it's both at the same time. So we need to seek to be an environmentalist. Not one that disregards spiritual activities for mostly material pursuits, or that ignores climate and nature with some form of supernaturalism that's detached from the natural world. We do not move from one environment to the other. If in the early morning I'm in the garden digging weeds, and then later that day I'm in a worship service with my Bible open and praying, I haven't moved from one environment to another. I am in both places, at both times. I am in the environment of this world that is physical and the environment of this world that is spiritual. And it's actually much more healthy if when I'm worshiping or I'm gardening, if I'm aware of that and not trying to falsely separate those two things. I mean, there are things that are distinctly physical and things that are distinctly spiritual, but they function in a single biosphere. If I'm going to keep using that word, that's what our whole life is about. We are governed as much by laws of chemistry and physics as we are by morality and truth. And so it is that we all need to become healthy environmentalists. Okay? So as I hope you understand by now, I'm not talking about whether we're involved in, the climate change debate and which side of that we're on, and whether we're proponents of clean energy or we're proponents of traditional sources of energy, and how deeply we care about the environmental, impact on oceans, what we need to do about plastic and waste disposal and all of that. That's all important. It's all important. But what I'm saying is that when we think about those things, when we think about everything, including our religious faith and worship to God, we need to be complete environmentalists. We need to be well aware that God has placed us in a world, in a universe that functions physically and spiritually according to His laws and His sovereignty. And what is our message to people in the world around us? I think we have hopefully something to say to those who are concerned just about the physical environment. Maybe we have something to contribute to that conversation that has to do with the spiritual environment and the spiritual aspects of our biosphere. And the same thing when it comes to matters of faith and worship and the practice of Christianity and the worship of God. I think we also have something to say, maybe first of all something to learn if we haven't, about that we don't somehow step out of the reality of this world and go into some kind of fantasy world as a religion or form of worship, but that we're still a part of God's created order, the biosphere that is both physical and spiritual. Okay, I hope that isn't too sort of philosophical to be practical for you. To me, it's very practical because it applies to everything I do. Whether, I think I'm doing something that's a spiritual activity or I think I'm doing some kind of mundane physical activity, it's very relevant that I not disregard the other aspect. Let me just read the verses again. Spend a lot of time this week thinking about this stuff. Go back to Psalm 36. There's a lot of other things to look at there, but especially in verses 5 and 6. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds, your righteousness is like the mighty mountains, your judgments are like the great deep. You save humans and animals alike. Okay? That's the spiritual environment in which we live. And so it is that we all need to become healthy environmentalists, because in 21, He's still the one.